Hello, I'm Karen Whitmire, and today I'd like to talk to you about new relationship energy and attachment. In the blog post we posted a few weeks ago about NRE as the variation of limerence, I discussed how this phase of a relationship should not be mistaken for your attachment style or any sort of attachment. What I want to look at a little closer today is the attachment, what attachment is, and how your attachment style might influence the way that your NRE shows up. I also want to help you understand how your attachment is separate from NRE. This will also help you understand why when your NRE wears off, some of you revert to a state that is very different from the NRE state. So, what is attachment theory? For those of you that aren't familiar with it, attachment theory was originally developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth to describe the different ways that babies reacted to their caregivers when the caregiver exited and re-entered the room. It has been subjected to the nature versus nurture debate as much as any other psychological theory. Like many of those other psychological phenomenon, the answer is always that it is probably a mix of the two. Other theorists since then have hypothesized that the attachment that shows up in childhood is the same attachment that you end up with in adulthood, and you are unlikely to move it much. Much more recently, this has been shown to be a little inaccurate. Adult experiences, therapy, and intentionality can actually do a great deal to shift your attachment style. Oxytocin and vasopressin are both hormones that have been linked to the development of attachment in animals and humans. And extensive research has been conducted with specifically oxytocin nasal spray and measuring the levels of oxytocin in blood to better understand attachment and how the levels of this hormone affect a wide variety of attachment-related behaviors. And this can be anything from threat detection, anxiety, in-grouping, xenophobia, desire, cooperation, and betrayal aversion. And they study even a couple of other behaviors that I'm not going to get into. So depending on what source you're engaging with, you end up with roughly 4 or 5 different attachment styles. You have a secure attachment style, a preoccupied or anxious attachment style. You also get a fearful, anxious attachment style, and a dismissive, avoidant attachment style. And then finally, you'll get a disorganized attachment style. Some of the theorists will put disorganized in as the dismissive avoidant. I actually am pretty sure they're two separate things. It just kind of depends on who you're talking to. I see disorganized, and some other theorists will see disorganized as a movement between the various anxious and dismissive avoidant styles, depending on what's going on. So a person who grew up feeling that their parents were generally caring for them, loving towards them, and provided a good home life towards them is likely to feel pretty secure in their adult relationships. People who don't feel like their parents cared for them or who weren't there for them may end up adopting any one of these other strategies to deal with the distress, depending on their biological inclination and what ended up working for them to get their parents' attention and what worked for them to get the love or what looked like love that they felt that they needed to survive. To help simplify attachment, because it can look pretty complicated at times, I often describe it to my clients as a rope between two people. And the way that you react to that rope and the person that's at the other end of the rope will help you get an idea about your attachment style. When you have a secure attachment, you will sometimes exist in several places along that rope, and you'll feel just fine existing in those places. If you start to move a little closer in, you might feel like you want to take a step back, or you might check in with your partner to see how you ended up getting that close, or if something that is going on to move you there, or you might decide you want to step in because something is going on and you want to be a little closer. Or you might move there because the times are really hard and that comfort feels good to you. Sometimes you might find that you move a little bit more distant from each other. And again, you'll notice, but you won't say become immediately distressed. You might think about it, and if you know what's going on, you'll accept that. You'll be able to weather that storm, or you might ask about it, and ultimately be okay with whatever answer your partner gives you. You trust that the rope is there, that it's going to keep you connected. And even if the other person at the end of the rope is sometimes hard to see, you ultimately trust that the other person is at the end of the rope and they are holding on to it. Someone who generally experiences secure attachment may be thrown off if they are also experiencing NRE as a strong limerent. They may start to feel as if they're sliding into a more preoccupied territory. Suddenly, they care very strongly about how another person feels about them. Their mood is very dependent on if that other person is reciprocating, and this may throw off the secure person. They might feel like they don't know themselves anymore. And then they're also maximizing that person's positive features and minimizing their negative features. So when the NRE wears off and they start to see the reality of the situation, they may try to hold on to that relationship much longer than they would have otherwise, because they generally feel like they can work through hardships and build on a strong foundation of love that they think they've already developed. Or they might really be blindsided by the reality of the rose-colored glasses coming off and realize that they need to end the relationship before it gets much further. After that, they might be very confused about how they ever ended up that deep into the relationship in the first place. Now, in avoidant attachments, the rope can feel very big and heavy, like it's a burden. And you want a lot of space on that rope, or you would prefer to just drop it altogether because it weighs too much. Holding the rope feels very vulnerable, and either you want to drop it because you assume the person on the other side is just going to drop their side anyway, or you feel the rope might be pointless because it's never done anything for you anyway. So there were some really interesting discoveries made by scientists that sort of ran counter to what they thought they were going to find. And you'll have to forgive us. All of the science tends to get done on cisgender people, and they tend to do it on one gender at a time. So in the studies that were originally done, most of them were done on men, and they were done on men with avoidant attachment styles. And those that were given the intranasal oxytocin were significantly more likely to have higher trust, lower betrayal aversion, and were more cooperative than their securely attached counterparts. So there were several hypotheses posited for why those with an avoidant attachment style were more likely to suddenly become more cooperative, but no one's really tested any of these hypotheses and had them pan out. So this also means that once the NRE or the oxytocin as it is wears off in a relationship, someone who's more on the avoidant side is likely to revert back to their avoidant tendencies unless they have some intentionality around this. If you find you fall more towards this end of the attachment spectrum, this is really important to keep in mind and relay to new partners. Unfortunately, it is difficult to get oxytocin nasal spray. They don't tend to just prescribe this because you are an avoidant person and you want to be more secure in your relationship. So it's not exactly like you can just go dose your partner into a secure attachment style. They actually have, they did used to do this in relationship therapy. It's not exactly convention these days. So the other side of this is if you've had significantly negative experiences during this NRE phase, as an avoidant person, you might come to really distrust the NRE phase. People who've been traumatized to the point that cues of safety and security have become paradoxical. You don't trust these cues anymore. You may find yourself becoming extra avoidant as soon as any relationship starts to feel any sort of safety or security. Your thinking brain will override the good feelings and you jump ship because experience has told you that this safety is a trick. And if you struggle with this, you should probably seek a trauma-informed therapist to figure out what these narratives are around safety and security can't be trusted. If you have a preoccupied attachment style, you don't trust in the rope itself to hold your relationship together. You don't trust the person at the other side is holding onto the rope either. You feel it's your duty to manage the rope, or you feel like you need to be right up on your partner holding their hand because that rope could break at any moment, or that partner could just not be thinking that they should be holding onto the rope anyway. This rope can feel more like a line of fragile silk. It's tenuous, it's thin, it's just not going to be there for you when you need it the most. Now, again, paradoxically, according to the researchers, for those who feel generally insecure in their relationships over the long term, the NRE stage can kick this problem into high gear. Although oxytocin helps those with avoidant attachment styles to build more trust and become more cooperative, it seems to do the exact opposite for those with preoccupied attachment styles. There was one researcher by the name of Bartz who did a lot of work in the early 2010s that found that both babies and adults with more anxious attachment styles increased their negative behavior towards parents, towards caregivers, when they were given oxytocin. And more specifically, in adults increased their negative interpretation of behaviors in others when given oxytocin. Now, disorganized attachment, like I said, there's some controversy over what exactly disorganized attachment is. It's very rare. One of those, only 1% of people end up with this attachment style. It's not well studied or documented except in extremely pathological situations. It's basically a mix of these preoccupied and avoidant states. I don't have like the training or education or experience to really get into this because there's not much out there, especially as it relates to oxytocin. But in this attachment style, you can think of it as the rope changing shape and changing form according to the situation. Today it's a heavy burden, tomorrow it's light as silk, sometimes it's a snake trying to strangle you. Either way, you don't really trust it. You might pick it up to pull someone in, and depending on how that person reacts to being pulled in, you might get scared. You're desperately wanting to hang on to them, but then they get too close, and so you drop it and decide you need to run away because it doesn't feel like that's working either. What I will say about this is that I imagine for those that are experiencing this, NRE must feel like a very confusing landscape and probably exacerbates a lot of what's going on with NRE. So I would recommend that anyone that feels like this is what's happening to them probably should go see a really good therapist that specializes in attachment to help. Regardless of your attachment style, NRE can feel like a wild ride. It can be really confusing. It can also be a lot of fun. And the more insight you can build into yourself, the more work you do to process and address what's going on with you and what you've experienced. So when you do this work and you've done the processing and you've got the insight, you can then communicate what you are experiencing to your partners, which leads to your ability to enjoy this a lot more, enjoy your new relationships, and lessens the negative impact on your existing ones. And this is where we actually go through how to get a lot of that insight in our NRE class as part of our 101 series. So feel free to go join us over at our website and learn more about that. Thank you for joining me today.